There's a kind of wound that leaves no visible mark. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was an absence, a consistent, pervasive, unremarkable absence of something that should have been there. A teaching that was never given. A message that was never transmitted. A version of the world that the child needed to receive and never did. The message is this: your needs matter. Not because you've earned it. Not because you've been good enough, or helpful enough, or easy enough to love. Simply because you're here. Because you're a person. Because what happens inside you, what you feel, what you need, what you want, is inherently worth attending to. For some people, that message landed early. It came in the specific quality of a parent's attention, the way they set everything else down when the child was upset, the way they asked questions and stayed for the answers, the way the child's inner world was treated consistently as something that mattered in the room. And for others, that message never quite arrived. Not because anyone said the opposite. Not because needs were explicitly punished or shamed. Just because the environment, whatever its reasons, whatever its limitations, whatever it was carrying of its own, simply didn't have the capacity to transmit it. Needs existed and were managed sometimes well. But the deeper teaching, that the presence of a need in you was itself significant, was itself something that warranted attention and care, was never given. And silence, it turns out, is a very effective teacher. Researcher Edward Tronick, whose work on early mother-infant interaction has become foundational in developmental psychology, designed a study that has since been replicated and analyzed across decades. In the still face experiment, a mother who has been warmly engaged with her infant is instructed to suddenly become neutral, not hostile, not absent, simply unresponsive. Her face goes still. She stops reacting. The child's response is immediate and escalating. They try to re-engage, smiling, vocalizing, reaching. When that produces no response, they try harder, with increasing urgency. And then, when the stillness persists, something shifts. The child withdraws, turns away, becomes difficult to re-engage even when the mother's warmth returns. What the still face experiment shows, with unusual clarity, is that absence is not neutral. The withdrawal of responsive attention, not punishment, not cruelty, just the removal of attuned presence, is experienced by the developing child as a profoundly disorganizing event. And when that absence is not an experiment, but a sustained feature of the environment, the lesson it teaches accumulates in layers. The lesson is, what I express, what I need, what I reach toward, does not reliably produce a response. And if it doesn't produce a response, it isn't, in the most practical sense, the kind of thing that matters here. The people who need to hear this most are usually the ones who believe it least. You are not responsible for managing everyone else's emotions. You are not required to be available every time someone calls. You are allowed to exist without being useful to someone. I know that's easier to hear than it is to believe. That's exactly why I went much deeper into this. In what I've left linked below, in the description, and in the first pinned comment. Donald Winnicott, the British pediatrician and psychoanalyst whose work on early development remains among the most influential in the field, described something he called the false self, a structure that forms when the child's authentic inner experience is consistently not met with adequate attunement. In the absence of a good enough holding environment, a parent who is responsive enough, often enough, to the child's actual emotional experience, the child begins to organize itself around the environment's demands rather than its own interior. The false self is not a lie, exactly. It's a survival structure, a version of the person that is competent, adaptive, socially legible, and that has quietly pushed the true self, the one with genuine needs and genuine responses, into a place where it won't cause disruption. The child who was never taught their needs matter grows into an adult who carries the structure into every room they enter. They're often remarkably capable of reading other people's needs. They developed that capacity in environments where attending to others was the primary available mode of connection. But when the attention turns inward, when someone asks, "What do you need?" the interior that question is aimed at is strangely quiet, not empty, but uncharted. Because charting it was never the assignment. Marsha Linehan at the University of Washington, In developing what has become one of the most empirically supported treatments in clinical psychology, described a concept she called the invalidating environment, a relational context that consistently communicates that a person's emotional responses are inappropriate, inaccurate, or not a legitimate basis for action. The invalidating environment doesn't have to be abusive. It can be well-meaning. It can love the child in its way. But it systematically fails to validate the child's inner experience as real, as important, as something worth taking seriously. And the child who grows up in an invalidating environment, or in an environment that simply never validates, which is not the same as one that actively invalidates, but produces similar results over time, develops a specific relationship with their own inner signals. They can't trust them, not because the signals are wrong, but because the signals were never treated as trustworthy by the environment that was supposed to teach them how to read themselves. They feel something and immediately wonder whether they're overreacting. They have a need and immediately question whether it's legitimate enough to warrant being expressed. They want something and immediately translate the wanting into terms that make it acceptable, useful, justified, non-demanding, before it's even reached the surface. This happens so automatically, so below the threshold of deliberate thought, that it stops feeling like doubt and starts feeling like just how things are. And here's where the cost becomes specific and compound. Because a person who can't trust their own internal signals doesn't just struggle to ask for what they need. They struggle to know what they need. The interior landscape that was supposed to be developed through years of being responded to, of having needs named, met, and in being met confirmed as real, that landscape remains partially unmapped. The signals exist, but the system for reading them was never fully calibrated. So when a need arrives, not a crisis, just an ordinary human need for connection, for care, for acknowledgement, for rest, it often arrives quietly and gets set aside before it's been fully identified. The person moves on, functions, and somewhere underneath the functioning, something continues to wait for an attention it has never quite learned to ask for. And there's something else, something that makes this particular pattern so difficult to see from the inside, that takes time to understand. The people who were never taught their needs matter were often not unhappy children. They adapted. They found ways to be loved through helpfulness, through being easy, through being the version of themselves that the environment could most comfortably receive. And that love was real. The family was often real, in its way. The connection was often genuine. But it was connection that didn't reach all the way in. That met the adapted version and called it the whole person. That loved what was visible and never quite learned there was more underneath. And the adult who carries this history often doesn't experience it as deprivation. They experience it as normal, as simply how things are for them, as the particular texture of their emotional life. The longing that's there is so old, so familiar, so thoroughly integrated into the architecture of daily experience that it no longer announces itself as longing. It just is. The background frequency of a life lived slightly outside of being fully held. But here's what almost nobody tells the person who has never taught their needs matter. The absence wasn't about you. It was about capacity. The environment that didn't give you the teaching didn't withhold it because you weren't worth giving it to. It couldn't give what it didn't have. Parents who were never taught their own needs mattered cannot easily transmit the belief to their children. Families that were themselves organized around scarcity, emotional scarcity, not necessarily material, produce children who learn the same organizing principle. This is not absolution. The cost is real, and it is yours to carry in ways that aren't fair. But understanding the origin is not the same as excusing it. It's the beginning of being able to separate what was transmitted from what is true. What is true is this: your needs matter. Not because you've earned it through sufficient giving, or sufficient difficulty, or sufficient time spent waiting. Because you're a person. And persons have needs that are, simply by virtue of existing, legitimate. That belief was not given to you. And it cannot be given to you now, not by this video, not by any single conversation, not by anyone else's certainty on your behalf. But it can be built, slowly, internally, through the accumulation of experiences that contradict the silence. Through relationships where your needs, when expressed, actually land somewhere. Through the practice, awkward and unfamiliar and necessary, of naming what you need before you've pre-justified it into something smaller. The person who was never taught their needs matter didn't become someone whose needs don't matter. They became someone who never fully believed they did. And there is an enormous distance between those two things, a distance that can be crossed, but only from the inside. If this video felt like it was written about your life, it kind of was. I've spent a long time putting words to this pattern. The exhaustion of always giving, the quiet hurt of not receiving, the confusion of not even knowing when it started. Everything I know about this is linked in the description and in the first pinned comment. Now I want to speak to you directly, and I want to do it differently than usual. I'm not going to ask you to remember a moment or trace a pattern back to its origin. I want to ask something simpler than that. Right now, not in the abstract, not in theory, do you have a need? It doesn't have to be large. It could be something small. The need for a few minutes of quiet. The need to be asked how you're doing and have it be a real question. The need for something to feel easy for once, instead of managed. The need to put something down that you've been carrying without anyone commenting on the weight. Do you have one? And if the answer is yes, can you name it?
Not justify it.
Not assess whether it's legitimate enough to deserve to be called a need. Just name it, to yourself, in the quiet of wherever you are. And then this, if someone asked you right now, what do you need? Could you answer? Not with what would be easiest for everyone. Not with what would ask the least of someone else. Just what you actually need. If that answer is hard to find, if the interior goes strangely quiet when the question is aimed directly at it, that's not emptiness. That's the specific silence of a landscape that was never fully developed. Of a question that was asked too rarely for the answer to become fluent. And fluency, in this domain, is possible. It builds slowly, through asking the question more often, through staying with the discomfort of the answer long enough to hear it, through finding one at a time the people and the context where the answer is received rather than redirected. You're not someone whose needs don't matter. You're someone who was raised in a silence that never told you they did. That silence was not the truth. It was an absence. And what was absent can, over time, be filled. The filling doesn't happen through declaration. Not through a single conversation or a sudden shift in self-perception. It happens through something closer to what Winnicott described as the holding environment, not the original one which was insufficient, but the one that becomes possible in adult relationships chosen carefully enough. Marsha Linehan's framework for validation makes a specific point here. Feeling that one's needs are legitimate requires, initially, the experience of having them validated by someone outside the self. The child who is raised in silence cannot simply tell themselves their needs matter. The belief was not formed by internal reasoning. It was formed, or not formed, by relational experience. And it is rebuilt, when it is rebuilt, through more of the same, not through someone telling you your needs are valid. Through them receiving your needs as real, responding to them as if they count, staying in the room without requiring you to shrink first. Each moment of genuine responsiveness is one more piece of evidence against the original silence. It doesn't erase the silence, but it accumulates. And what accumulates over time becomes a new kind of baseline, one that doesn't demand you earn your presence, but simply confirms that your presence is already enough. You've spent a long time making room for everyone else's needs. You've gotten extraordinarily good at it. You could do it in your sleep. Now, carefully, slowly, without abandoning any of the care that is genuinely yours, you get to start making room for your own. That is not selfishness. That is, finally, the rest of the lesson. If something in this video reached you, leave a comment. Tell me one need you've been carrying that you've never said out loud. I read every single one. And if this series has been part of something for you, thank you for being here.
Subscribe and stay.
Because what comes next goes somewhere new. The pattern was always pointing somewhere. Now, we find out where.